Good evening. I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study in Exodus. And tonight we're going to cover chapter 6, or at least we're going to get started. I had said last week that it would probably take a couple weeks to get through chapter 6, and you'll see why when we get into it. But there is a chance that we'll be able to get all the way through it tonight. But before we jump into chapter 6, I want to start where we did last week because there is a definite pattern that we've seen going back to the end of Exodus chapter 4 in how people can initially start out in faith and trust and full of confidence and boldness, and that can quickly waver when circumstances or adversity comes, especially when expectations are, as we see in this case, for an immediate release or immediate reprieve from injustice or suffering. And so that's been a challenge throughout human history for humans to be able to endure injustice and suffering and not get weary and not allow it to affect their attitudes and their confidence towards God. And so going back to Exodus chapter 4 and verse 29, this is Moses and Aaron arriving in Egypt. And let's just read in verse 29. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spake all the words which Yahweh had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. So again, we see an initial reception, an initial response. We see evidence of faith. And it's as we continue, it says, and when they heard that Yahweh had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. So in their minds, responding to the signs and the good news that Moses and Aaron bring, they believe in their hearts that immediately they will be delivered and there will be relief from the slavery that they have been under all of their lives. And so they're excited. They respond gratefully. They worship the Lord. And we'll see that does something for Moses and Aaron too. It emboldens them. Because when you go into chapter 5, Moses and Aaron confidently go before Pharaoh and demand the release of the Hebrew people. And so that doesn't go well though, right? It doesn't work out the way they think it was going to. I don't know what they had envisioned because God already told Moses it would take a mighty hand for them to be set free. And so he has underestimated what all he's going to have to endure and go through before they're finally released. But he starts out, Moses and Aaron start out with confidence, and they demand the release. And Pharaoh pretty much scoffs at them and scoffs at Yahweh. Who's Yahweh? And again, we'll see in the coming chapters, he'll find out the hard way who Yahweh is. But nonetheless, he gives no attention to what Moses and Aaron demand in releasing the Hebrew people. Matter of fact, he says that they have too much idle time, and he adds more work by making the Hebrew slaves go out and gather their own straw to make the brick. And not only that, he doesn't decrease the quota that they are expected to produce each day. And so that puts internal pressure on the community of Israelites because you have a chain of command. You have Pharaoh, who has his taskmasters that are Egyptian, who have under them Hebrew foremen who are over the slaves themselves. And when the slaves are unable to meet the quota and produce the proper amount of bricks each day, the foremen, the Hebrew foremen, are taken and beaten. And obviously the response that is going to come from them is they're going to put more pressure on the slaves who are already overworked, demanding that they meet the quota, which is impossible to meet. And so you have a lot of unfortunate circumstances. It's very unjust. It's very cruel. It's very inhumane what they are having to deal with. And in the midst of that injustice and that suffering, they lose heart. They lose faith. And they start to get bitter in their hearts because of what they are going through. They're no longer focused on God's promise. They're no longer believing the report that Moses and Aaron brought. And so they're upset. Now, I'm going to scroll down into chapter 5 and save us the reading through that again. But I want to pick up in verse 20, and that'll set us up for chapter 6. This is the Hebrew foremen, after they have been beaten, who come to Moses and Aaron in verse 20. And they met Moses and Aaron, who stood in the way as they came forth from Pharaoh. And they said unto them, The Lord look upon you and judge, because you have made our savor or our smell to be abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to slay us. So again, they're speaking to the conditions that they are now under since Moses and Aaron went before Pharaoh and demanded their release. It's actually worked against them and brought more injustice and more labor. And so what are they doing? They're blaming Moses and Aaron, which at the same time would be blaming God, because God is the one who sent Moses and Aaron. And this is a reoccurring theme for the next 40 years. When things don't go well for the Israelites, they result to the blame game. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. The foremans are blaming Moses and Aaron. And because Moses and Aaron no longer have the support of the people, that causes their faith to waver as well. Watch what is said in verse 22. And Moses returned unto Yahweh and said, Lord, or Adonai. He doesn't even use the divine name, right? So he's already condescended here. And that's a problem, because he has forgotten what Yahweh has said in chapter 3 about his name. I will be with you. You can trust me. I'll be with you. And so he's already forgotten what God has promised him. So he says, Wherefore have you so evil entreated this people? So he actually accuses God of doing unjustly. He has accused God of doing evil. But fortunately, he at least was bold enough to do that to the Lord himself and not behind his back. And he goes on and says in verse 23, For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and neither hast thou delivered your people at all. So he's complaining to God, which is better than complaining about God. But nonetheless, it's interesting that it's like God is pretending he never even hears him. He doesn't even respond to his complaining. He goes back to what he initially tried to bring affirmation in Moses, and that is the greatness and the power of his name. In other words, he's going to use the shock factor and say, Moses, have you forgotten who I am? I am the creator. I am the self-existent one who has always been, who is, and always will be. You can trust me. And that's essentially what we're going to see here in chapter 6. The Lord is going to try to speak back into Moses' life, give him confidence, because he truly has been shaken, because he has lost the support of the people, and things have not went as he has expected. So let's continue reading. Verse 1, chapter 6. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand shall he let them go, and with a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land. So again, he affirms that it's going to take quite the doing for Pharaoh to get to the point to where he releases the Hebrew people. In verse 2 he says, And God spake unto Moses and said unto him, I am Yahweh. I am Yahweh, which is a statement that is powerful enough to shake heaven and earth. In verse 3, he says, "And I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, unto Jacob, by the name of God Almighty," or in the Hebrew, it's El Shaddai. And that name, El Shaddai, God reveals himself in Genesis chapter 17 directly to Abraham, who is the first patriarch. And then later on in chapter 35 in Genesis, he reveals that name to Jacob. Also, we see in dialogue that Isaac uses the name God Almighty, El Shaddai, in Genesis 28 in verse 3. And then Jacob uses it in dialogue as well later on in Genesis 43 and I believe verse 14. And so this name El Shaddai truly was known to the patriarchs. But watch what he says. He goes on and says, "But by my name Jehovah," notice that it's highlighted in yellow like Lord is all throughout this passage. There's a reason for that, because it's the same Hebrew name. It's the same Hebrew word, which is the Tetragrammaton, which is Yud He Vav He, which we customarily say as Yahweh or Yahweh, and that's the divine name of God. And I explained that a few weeks ago, that the divine name of God, Yud He Vav He, is a conjugation of the past, present, and future tense of He was, He is, and He will be, which in essence says that God is the sole self-existent one who has no beginning and no end. And so that speaks of the greatness of who He is. But notice what it says there. "But by my name, Yahweh, was I not known to them." Now, this has been a problem in scholarship, and this has been part of the reason why you have the documentary hypothesis or the source hypothesis, which I explained several weeks ago. I won't go over that again because I know that it's boring to those who are not interested in text criticism. But it is important to see that because this verse is taken so literally, that has empowered that hypothesis, which we have totally disproved, and we're fixing to completely dismantle that theory here in just a moment with the text. We're actually going to go back into Genesis and let the text show us whether or not the name Yud He Vav He, Yahweh, was known to the patriarchs or not, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so that's what I want to do for a few minutes. I want to show you how to study and how to investigate this problem, or supposed problem. It's really not. It's real simple if you just do a little investigating. How to solve this, though. I want to show you the process. And the first thing that we ask is there anywhere in Genesis where Yahweh reveals His name to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob? Does He come out and say it? And furthermore, is there anywhere else in Genesis that others say in dialogue the name Yahweh? Or is it included in personal names of people? Or is it included in place names, location names? And so that's something that we're going to investigate. And so how we're going to do that is I'm going to pull up a search. If you'll look on this screen over here, and I've ran a morphology on the lemma of God's name. And you'll see that it's one of the most prominent words used in the Hebrew Old Testament. Matter of fact, there are 6,828 times this name is used, Yahweh, in 5,791 different verses. So this is a very, very used name in the Old Testament. But what we need to do is we need to look in Genesis, because Genesis is where the patriarchs are found, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their stories. especially from chapter 12 onward. And so what we do is we go to Genesis and we see, is the name used by God himself? Is the name used by the patriarchs or anyone else in Genesis for that matter? Because what the documentary hypothesis claims is this was added by priestly sources after the exile, and they inserted the name Yahweh anachronistically in places that it originally wouldn't have been. We're going to see there's no credibility to that claim whatsoever. And so I want to just start scrolling through, and I'm going to click on them on this screen, and on the other screen, in the main screen, where we see the actual text, we'll actually look at some of those. And the first example is in Genesis 4 and verse 1. Watch what it says. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, or Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from who? From Yahweh. So Adam and Eve clearly knew the divine name, right? Because this is a dialogue. This is her words being spoken. And she said, I have gotten a man from Yahweh. So obviously Adam and Eve knew the divine name. Now let's scroll down to verse 26. After the story of Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel. And in verse 26, it says, and to Seth, who was born after the Cain and Abel incident, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men to call upon the name of Yahweh. How many of you know it's really hard to call upon the name of Yahweh if you don't know the name of Yahweh? Right? Real simple. Now let's just keep scrolling into chapter 5 and verse 29. This is said about Noah at his birth by his father Lamech. And he called his name Noach, which means rest, saying, this same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which Yahweh has cursed. So again, Noah's father Lamech knew the divine name as well. Now let's skip down to Genesis chapter 9. And after the flood story, this is Noah. Let's back up to verse 24. Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, watch what Noah says. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem. Okay, so how could Noah say the divine name if he didn't know it? Right? And we know that Shem is the one who actually brought forth the descendants who would evolve into what we know as the Israelites. Okay, so Noah knew the divine name. Now let's just scroll down to chapter 10, and this is around the time of the Tower of Babel, and it's talking about in verse 8, and Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Verse 9, he was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, this is the people saying, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. So again, the people around the time of the Tower of Babel know the divine name of Yahweh. Now let's just keep scrolling into chapter 12, which is very important because this is where we get into the patriarchs and their lives. And in chapter 12 and verse 8, let's just read verse 7. And the Lord appeared unto Avram, and said, unto your seed will I give this land. And there built an altar unto Yahweh, who appeared unto him. Okay, so far it's narrative. Verse 8. And he removed from there unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of Yahweh. Right? Every time we see this word Lord in all capitals and highlighted in yellow to make it easy for us, that is the divine name. So he called upon the divine name, Yahweh. So did Abraham know the divine name? Yes. So what we've seen in Exodus chapter 6, when Yahweh says to Moses, I have not made myself known to the patriarchs by Yahweh, it cannot be literal. It means something else. We'll talk about that when we return to the text. I'm not done showing you evidence that everyone throughout human history knew the divine name of Yahweh. Okay, so let's look at some more examples. Let's go into chapter 13. In verse 4 it says, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. So he's still using the divine name. Let's scroll on down into chapter 15, because this is where it's an exact of what we've seen in Exodus. In chapter 15, this is where Yahweh makes covenant with Abram, who hasn't had his name changed at this point. But let's see, verse 7. And he said unto him, and this is the exact phrase that we see in Exodus, I am Yahweh. Same statement that was made to Moses is made to Abraham. I am Yahweh that brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God. Notice that God's all capitals. It's because it's Adonai Yahweh. So Yahweh says or reveals his name to Abraham, and Abraham says it back. Okay? So again, this is just overwhelming evidence to how we cannot take Exodus chapter 6 literal. Let's keep going. Let's go into the next chapter, in chapter 16. This is Sarah, who is called Sarai at this point in verse 2. And Sarai said unto Avram, behold, now Yahweh has restrained me from bearing. Okay, so she knows the divine name also. Let's keep going. All you have to do is just keep scrolling and look for the highlights. And hopefully I didn't just crash it by doing so. Okay, so we made it all the way through and seen that Sarah knew the divine name. So let's go to Genesis 18. Okay. In verse 14, let's back up to verse 13. And Yahweh said unto Abraham, the only thing that happened since I deleted that slide is Yahweh won't be highlighted in yellow now. So, but look for the all capital Lord, okay? And Yahweh said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for Yahweh? So he says it. So here we see it again. Let's go to chapter 19. I'm trying not to scroll. Well, while it's coming back up, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some verses to write down, and you can check for yourself, okay? Because it's not cooperating. In chapter 19, verse 13 and 14, we see the divine name used between the angels and Lot and his son-in-laws. In chapter 21 and verse 33, we see it in connection with Abraham again. In chapter 22, in the story of the binding of Isaac, it appears because the location that Isaac is taken and bound is in the land of Moriah, right? Moriah. And after the attempted sacrifice and the intervention, Abraham names the place Yahweh Yireh, or Yahweh He will see. In a lot of English translations, it's translated God will provide. But it's literally in Hebrew, Yahweh He will see. And I think that is prophetic about Christ being the sacrifice, just like it was enacted with Abraham and Isaac. But let me try to pull up this and let it kind of calm down. And let me give you some more. I really wanted to show you chapter 22 because, it's impossible for him to name the place Yahweh Yireh if he doesn't know the divine name. Okay? So, another example is in chapter 24, where, at least it's the chapter where Eleazar, or the eldest servant of Abraham, is sent to get a wife for Isaac. Like everybody in that story in chapter 24 uses the divine name Yahweh. So I encourage you to go check it out in chapter 24. In chapter 26, in verses 22 and 25, we see it used in connection with Isaac. In chapter 27, in verse 7, 20, and 27, we see it used with Isaac. And then in chapter 28, in verse 13 through 17, we see it used in the incident with Jacob at Bethel. And then in chapter 29, we see Leah use the name of Yahweh. So I think that's sufficient enough to make it an obvious conclusion that everyone knew the divine name. And so when we go, I'm scared to touch it. When we go to chapter 6, in verse 3, and we read that again, and I appeared unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by the name of God Almighty, or El Shaddai. And a little note on El Shaddai, not really sure what Shaddai means. It's translated Almighty because of how the Septuagint translated it from the Hebrew text, but most likely it means God of the mountain, something related to the mountain. And so, again, we can't be sure because the etymology of Shaddai is not certain, and it's a shared root that's used in like Akkadian and some of the other languages that are similar to Hebrew from that area in the ancient Near East. So most likely it means God of the mountain in some form or fashion, which makes sense because we have God mentioned as dwelling on the mountains and etc. throughout Scripture. So that's what that means. But back to our point, but by my name, Yahweh, was I not known to them. So we know that doesn't mean literal. And so I think what he's trying to tell Moses is, I have not revealed the power of my name in such a way as I'm about to for the Israelites. And clearly that has to be the purpose of what he's saying here, because he is going to demonstrate his power in an unprecedented way. Really, it cannot be said that Yahweh has demonstrated his power before a nation such as Egypt as he will in the 10 plagues, just miraculous signs and wonders that he will bring to pass before Pharaoh and all of Egypt. And so he's talking about what he's essentially going to do, and that's how we need to understand this particular verse. Okay, let's continue. Verse 4. He says, and I have also established my covenant with them. Okay, and clearly he would have used his name in that process. He established his covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers. So he's directly referencing Genesis 15, which we kind of peeked at, where he made the covenant with Abraham and he promised that they would return to that land, but he also specifically said that they would be slaves in a foreign land, and they would return after the fourth generation, after the iniquities of the Amorites was fulfilled. And so that's what we're seeing come to pass. God initiated the covenant promise with the patriarchs, but here he's going to fulfill it long after their time. Okay? Verse 5, and I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Okay? So again, here's another example of if we were to take it literal, that would mean that God had made the covenant with Abraham, and somewhere along the way he got busy, being God, and he forgot about his covenant, right? Of course, that's not what it means. Not everything can be taken literally. And this is where it's really important to be educated in the right circles. And that's something that I was very fortunate to have the opportunity. About 8 or 9 years ago, I started studies I started learning the Hebrew language in 2010. But after that, I enrolled in classes and courses through Hebrew University where every one of my instructors in the learning Hebrew for the Old Testament were Israelis. They had been immersed in the culture, the customs, and the language, the Hebrew language, their entire lives. And they were a wealth of knowledge, even though none of them that I recall were messianic or believed in Jesus or anything like that. They were a wealth of knowledge in relation to the Old Testament, understanding syntax, grammar, euphemisms, idioms, and things like that. And so I gleaned a lot during that time. And so when we see God say, I have remembered my covenant, or I have remembered XYZ, that is God's way of saying, I am about to do something. He is about to take action. Okay, so that's just a Hebrew euphemism for God about to take action. And so verse 6, he says, wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am Yahweh. That statement right there should bring strength and comfort to them, because they're going to see what that means in fullness, in short order. He says, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rid you out of their bondage. I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments, and I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, which brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Now I read verses 6 through 8 because in that particular phrase of God saying what he's going to do, there are 7 verbs and 7 verbal clauses or clauses, sentence clauses, where God is saying what he's going to do with the Israelite people, which kind of is important because number 7 happens to be the number that represents completion or perfection and is most associated with God. Not only that, in these verses, this is where the 4 Passover Seder cups are derived from the phrases, I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, and I will take you. And I encourage you to you could go to something as simple as like Wikipedia and type in Passover Seder. Passover Seder. S-E-D-E-R. Seder means order. And it basically will explain to you the order of the meal, the Passover meal that is observed by the Israelites. And they have 4 cups. I know most of you have probably heard of it, but they have 4 cups called the Passover cups. And the first one is the Kiddush, which is the blessing or the cup of sanctification. The second one is the Magid, which is connected to the telling of the Exodus story that they do. The third one, and this is the cup that is identical to the one we see in the Gospels with the Last Supper, where the Lord says, "This is the cup of the New Testament of my blood." It's called Bikrat Hamazon, and that is the blessing after the meal. Again, that's the one that you see in the Gospels in relation to the Last Supper. And then you have the fourth cup, which was the cup that they set out for Elijah, who was to come before the Messiah. And it's called Hallel, and they would actually go and recite portions of Psalm 113 through 118, which we also see in the Gospels as well. And that cup, I believe, is the cup that Jesus promises to fulfill when he returns, because when he initiates the Last Supper, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me till I come." And so I believe that this is the cup that we will drink at the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is the consummation of the betrothal. Okay? That's what's really interesting in, let's see, where is it? Verse 7. "I will take you to me for a people." That's marital, covenantal relation to marriage language. And notice what it goes on and says, "And I will be to you a God." That's exactly what we see at the end of the story in Revelation, right? You have the marriage supper of the Lamb, you have the new heavens and the new earth arriving in the land, right? That's what they're being promised here. They're going to be taken to the land. That's what we're promised as Christians, that we are going to be in the new heavens and the new earth. We're going to be with him, and we are betrothed to Christ. And you see in the Old Testament that Israel is the bride of God, whereas in the New Testament, the church is the bride of Christ. So you have this marriage covenant language here that's very intimate in what Yahweh says he is going to do with the Israelites, as bringing them as a people unto himself, and him being a God unto them. And he says, "You shall know that I am Yahweh." You will know that he is Yahweh, which brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And so again, I would encourage you to go and check out the Passover Seder. Another interesting point about the 4 Passover cups is that you have a cup per letter of the divine name, which is interesting because the divine name happens to be a major focus of this lesson. So Yud Hey Vav Hey, you have a cup per letter of the divine name of Yahweh. Okay? Now, let me scroll. Verse 8, "And I will bring you into the land concerning that which I did swear to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a heritage," or better said, not a heritage, but a possession. And watch what he says again. "I am Yahweh." In verse 9, "And Moses spake so unto the children of Israel, but they hearkened not unto Moses for anguish of spirit," or literally shortness of spirit, "and for cruel bondage." So, again, they started out with initial belief. They were worshiping and bowing down to Yahweh, but now, because circumstances continue to work against them, injustice prevails, or so it seems, they're not listening to Moses. They don't believe him because of the shortness of spirit, which would be a euphemism for exhaustion. They're just mentally worn down, mentally beat down, and the bondage and the beatings and the labor have just forced them into a place to where they cannot take their eyes off the circumstances. And so they've lost hope. They've lost faith because of circumstances. In verse 10, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Go in, speak unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that he let the children of Israel go out of his land. And Moses spake before Yahweh," or the Lord, "saying, Behold, the children of Israel have not hearkened unto me. How then shall Pharaoh hear me, who am of uncircumcised lips, which is obviously a euphemism that he is using as an excuse. You know, he used this excuse in different terms earlier, that he's not eloquent of speech. He's slow to speak. He's a slow of tongue. And so he's lost the confidence that he had in chapter 5, right? Boy, he was confident when he had the support of the people, but now that he's lost that, he's kind of backing up and doesn't want to go in and speak before Pharaoh. And so, verse 13, and the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, and gave them a charge unto the children of Israel and unto Pharaoh king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land. Now, what we're going to see here beginning in verse 14 is something that is odd to us in the way that we understand literature from a modern perspective. We're going to see inserted a genealogy, which again to us is like, where did that come from? Again, the source hypothesis, documentary hypothesis, want to use this as evidence that you have different writers inserting different portions of the Torah, and because this is totally out of place. But that's to ignore the body of evidence of ancient Near East writings. This was very common to them. Genealogies and knowing where they came from were very important. And so what we're going to see here for several verses is a genealogy that's going to begin with the first two sons of Jacob. And then when we get to the third son, it's going to focus a lot more detail on the genealogy of the tribe of Levi. And the obvious reason why is because this is going to be the dominant tribe for the rest of the Torah, because it is the tribe which has been assigned the priestly order and the duty of serving Yahweh in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and obviously that will be transferred later on to the temple in Jerusalem. So this is kind of an insertion to show or to initiate a group that will later be a very prominent group within the Israelite community. Not only that, even more particular, it is the lineage of Moses and Aaron. And obviously we're going to see that Aaron becomes the high priest, and his sons will follow in his footsteps and carry out worship to Yahweh. So what are some of the purposes of this genealogy that we're going to see? Again, it's going to focus on the Levitical line through Aaron. Remember, Exodus is theological history. And so knowing and understanding the Levitical line and what the purpose of the Levitical line is very important to theological history. It also connects, as we'll see, it will connect the patriarchs to the current. Okay? Not only that, it will also foreshadow the future, as we'll see with Phinehas, because he is a figure who will reappear later on in Numbers 25 and Joshua 22 as a grandson to Aaron. And so, kind of like we've seen in Acts, where they introduce a character who will play a prominent role later on, that's kind of what we see going on here. Okay? Okay, verse 14. These be the heads of their fathers' houses, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, Hanoch, Palu, Hezron, Carmi. These be the families of Reuben. Notice how brief it is in just first generation after Reuben. Verse 15. And the sons of Simeon, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Yachin, and Zohar, and Shaul, the son of the Canaanitish woman. These are the families of Simeon. So again, you just have one generation after Simeon, who is one of the 12 tribal leaders. And then when we move into verse 16, we're going to see that it's a lot more detailed and extends further generations. And it makes us ask, what is the point in mentioning the first two tribes, Reuben and Simeon, because no more tribes are even mentioned after them, is to show that the Levites are not the firstborn, and that they have been chosen because of merit and of worth to fulfill one of the most prominent roles in Israelite, order, and that is the priestly role. So verse 16, and these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations, Gershon and Kohath and Merari. And notice that it starts giving ages. It gets more and more detailed. And the years of the life of Levi were 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Libni, Shimi, according to the families. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Izhar, and Hebron, and Uziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years. Verse 19. And the sons of Merari, Mahali, Mushi, these are the families of Levi according to their generations. And now it's going to return to, in verse 20, one of the sons of Levi, which is the Kohath family. In verse 20 it says, and Amram took unto him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife. So this is Moses and Aaron's father takes Jochebed, which is his father's sister, which would make that what? His aunt. This is internal evidence that gives favor to Mosaic authorship. And you may say, why is that? Because Levitical law in Leviticus 18 and verse 12 forbids a man to marry his aunt. And if a later priestly exile, after the Babylonian captivity, if someone who is of the priestly family would have wrote this part, they would not have included something that would have violated Levitical law. That would have just been abhorrent to them. Matter of fact, it was so abhorrent that the Septuagint translators translated it into cousin instead of aunt, because Levitical law doesn't forbid the marrying of cousins, but it does aunt. And so undoubtedly the original would be as it is written here, that it was the aunt that Amram married. And this is not the first time that's happened. It's happened in Genesis as well, as we've seen. But the point is, Moses would have written this, whereas a later priestly source would not have written that because it would transgress Levitical law. And so this yields authenticity to Mosaic authorship and shows support that he indeed is the author of the Torah, with minimal editing here and there, as we've talked about in times past. And let's continue reading. And she bare him Aaron and Moses. This is like one of 5 times you will see Aaron and Moses listed in that order, where Aaron is first. And the reason why is this is highlighting the priestly line, and Aaron happens to be the high priest. So Aaron and Moses occurs in that order 5 times, and I think 78 times in the reverse order, where Moses is first, Moses and Aaron. Okay, and the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. I actually was going through some research on this, and something struck my attention, and I'll try to include this in our group so that you can look at this. But I was reading a commentary from Umberto Cassuto, who was a Hebrew rabbi who lived in Florence, Italy, from 1883 to 1951. Brilliant guy. And he was talking about how he believes these numbers are not literal as far as the ages that is given here, that they are symbolic. And he gave a particular method that I hadn't heard of what they would allude to and what they would mean, and how if you use this method, you can actually come up with the 430 years that we talked about earlier. So I will attach that in our Facebook group, and if I happen to forget, somebody please speak up and remind me, because it was interesting. I'm not saying that it's accurate, but it was interesting because there is a lot of talk about a lot of the genealogies in the Bible and how many times numbers are symbolic. And so I think it would be worth everyone's time to read it, if nothing else. Verse 21, the sons of Izhar, Korah, and Nepheg. We'll see that Korah is a cousin to Moses and Aaron, who leads a revolt or rebellion against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, Numbers chapter 16. Verse 22, and the sons of Uzziel, Mishael, Elzaphan, and Zithri. And Aaron took him, Elisheva, is how you say that, Elisheva, which in English would be Elizabeth. Okay, Elizabeth is actually a Hebrew name, and it's pronounced Elisheva. And Elisheva was a Judahite. Ironically, Aaron married a woman who was from the tribe of Judah, which is interesting because what tribe was Jesus from? Judah. Matter of fact, it says that she's the daughter of Aminadab, and she was the sister of Nachshon. Okay? Both of those are in the genealogy of King David and in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Interesting, I thought. And she bare him Nadav and Abihu. We'll see that they offer strange fire and God kills them. And Eleazar and Itamar are the other two sons who will fulfill their role after they're zapped by God. Verse 24, and the sons of Korah, Asher, Elkanah, Abiasaph, these are the family of the Korahites. And Eleazar, Aaron's son, took him one of the daughters of Putiel to wife, and she bare him Phinehas. Now again, Phinehas will play a prominent role in Numbers chapter 25 because he helps stop the plague that led to 24,000 dying at Baal Peor. And so we'll read that story in due time. So again, it focuses on him because he'll play a prominent role later on. These are the heads of the fathers of the Levites according to their families. And then returning to the last portion of this reading here in this chapter, these are that Aaron and Moses, to whom the Lord, Yahweh, said, bring out the children of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their armies. So they're going to go from slaves to warriors. These are they which spake to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring out the children of Israel from Egypt. These are that Moses and Aaron. And that's where we're going to stop, right there. And we'll pick up in verse 28 next week and get into chapter 7. And we will see that Yahweh will begin to make his name known to everyone, and there will be no way to escape it because he is going to bring forth his power and his glory. So I hope you gleaned something from our study tonight. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope no one has been affected by this sickness. I hope you are taking advantage of the extra time to spend with family and to spend with God. And until next time, we will see you later. God bless you guys.